Welcome back to XRP on Moon, and today we're diving into a statement that sounds simple on the surface, but could carry life-changing implications for those who truly understand what's unfolding right now in the crypto space. 1000 XRP will change your life. That's not just a catchy headline. For many long-term holders, for many insiders watching the financial system evolve in real time, this is a belief grounded in a much bigger narrative, one that most people are still sleeping on. Because here's the truth. We are not just talking about a digital asset. We are talking about a potential shift in how money itself moves across the world. Right now, the average person looks at XRP and sees a price that feels low, maybe under a few dollars, maybe fluctuating, maybe even frustratingly stagnant at times. But what they don't see is the infrastructure quietly being built behind the scenes. They don't see the corridors being opened, the partnerships being explored, the regulatory clarity slowly forming piece by piece. And most importantly, they don't see the scale. Because if XRP is positioned to become a bridge asset for global liquidity, then we're not talking about small price movements. We're talking about exponential revaluation driven by real-world utility. Think about it like this. The global payment system moves trillions of dollars every single day. Not millions, trillions. And it does so through outdated systems that are slow, expensive, and inefficient. Banks rely on Nostro and Vostro accounts, locking up massive amounts of capital just to facilitate cross-border transactions. This is where XRP enters the conversation in a very serious way. The idea is simple but powerful. Instead of pre-funding accounts around the world, institutions could use XRP as a bridge, instantly moving value from one currency to another in seconds. Now imagine what happens if even a fraction of that global liquidity starts flowing through XRP. Suddenly, the demand for XRP isn't based on hype or speculation. It's based on necessity. It becomes a tool, a utility, a piece of infrastructure. And when an asset becomes infrastructure, its value is no longer dictated by retail sentiment alone. It's driven by institutional demand. That's the shift most people are missing right now. So when someone says 1000 XRP will change your life, they're not necessarily talking about today's price. They're talking about a future where XRP is deeply integrated into the financial system. A future where holding even a relatively small amount could represent significant value because of how scarce and in demand that liquidity becomes. And here's the psychological part that most people struggle with. The patience required to hold through uncertainty, because the market doesn't reward those who react emotionally. It rewards those who understand the bigger picture and position themselves early. Let's break it down further. If XRP were to reach levels that reflect its potential utility, levels that some analysts speculate could be in the double digits, triple digits, or beyond, then 1000 XRP suddenly transforms from a modest holding into something much more significant. Even at $10, that's $10,000. At $100, that's $100,000. And while those numbers might sound unrealistic to skeptics, remember this. Every major financial shift in history looked unrealistic before it happened. The internet looked unrealistic. Digital banking looked unrealistic. Even Bitcoin itself was dismissed for years before it shocked the world. And now, we're at a stage where the next evolution of finance is being built, and XRP is one of the few assets positioned directly in that transformation narrative. But the window to accumulate at lower prices doesn't stay open forever. That's the part that creates urgency without most people realizing it. At the same time, this isn't about blind belief, it's about connecting the dots, watching regulatory developments, observing how institutions move, understanding the role of liquidity in global finance. Because once you start to see how all of these pieces fit together, the idea of 1000 XRP being life-changing stops sounding crazy and starts sounding like a calculated position. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because as more clarity enters the market, as uncertainty begins to fade, and as adoption slowly accelerates, the narrative around XRP could shift very quickly. What was once ignored could suddenly become the center of attention. And when that shift happens, it won't be gradual. It will be explosive. That's why the real question isn't whether 1000 XRP can change your life. The real question is whether you're positioned before the rest of the world realizes what's happening. The idea that 1000 XRP will change your life becomes even more powerful when you start looking at what is quietly developing behind closed doors in the global financial system. Because while retail investors are focused on short-term price movements and daily charts, a much bigger transformation is taking shape in the background, one that revolves around liquidity, settlement speed, and the future of cross-border payments. And XRP sits directly in the middle of that conversation. To understand understand this properly, you have to stop thinking like a trader for a moment and start thinking like an institution. Banks and financial networks don't care about hype. They care about efficiency, cost reduction, and reliability. Every year, trillions of dollars are tied up in slow settlement systems that require multiple intermediaries just to move money from one country to another. This is not only inefficient, it is expensive. And in a world where financial efficiency equals competitive advantage, even a small improvement in settlement technology can create massive economic impact. This is where XRP's design becomes important. The entire concept behind it is not just digital currency speculation, but liquidity bridging. Instead of pre-funding accounts in different countries, institutions can theoretically use XRP as a neutral bridge asset that allows value to move instantly across borders. That means money doesn't sit idle anymore. It moves, it flows, it becomes more efficient. And efficiency at a global scale is not a small upgrade, it's a system-level transformation. Now, if you imagine XRP being used at scale in that environment, the conversation around price starts to shift completely. Because when utility demand enters the picture, supply dynamics begin to matter in a much deeper way. XRP is not infinitely available in circulation at active liquidity levels. A large portion is locked, held, or strategically managed. So as demand increases from institutions, the available liquid supply becomes more meaningful. That's where scarcity begins to play a role. Not artificial scarcity, but functional scarcity based on real usage. This is also where the emotional disconnect happens for most people. They look at XRP today and compare it to meme-driven assets or short-term speculative coins. But XRP was never built for that narrative. It was designed for infrastructure-level finance. And infrastructure assets do not behave like retail hype cycles. They evolve slowly at first, almost frustratingly so, until suddenly they reach a tipping point where adoption accelerates rapidly. That tipping point is what long-term holders are watching for, not because they are guessing, but because they understand how financial systems transition. Every major financial upgrade in history has followed a similar pattern. Early skepticism, slow institutional testing, regulatory uncertainty, gradual integration, and finally mass adoption. We are still somewhere in that transition curve when it comes to digital settlement assets, and XRP is positioned in a way that makes it a candidate for that final stage. So when someone mentions holding 1,000 XRP, the real conversation isn't about the number itself. It's about what that number could represent in a fully integrated financial system. Today, it may look like a small bag, but in a world where XRP is actively used as a bridge for global liquidity, even modest holdings could take on a completely different meaning. And that's where the psychological shift becomes important, because most people struggle to hold through uncertainty, especially when the outcome is not immediate or guaranteed in the short term. But markets don't reward impatience. They reward positioning. Those who understood early internet adoption, early mobile technology, or early Bitcoin accumulation were not rewarded because they timed the market perfectly. They were rewarded because they understood the direction of change before it became obvious. And that is exactly the kind of thinking required here. At the same time, it's important not to fall into fantasy thinking. XRP's future is not guaranteed, and no financial asset moves in a straight line. There are regulatory hurdles, market cycles, and adoption timelines that all play a role. But what cannot be ignored is the increasing attention from institutions and the ongoing exploration of blockchain-based settlement solutions. That alone signals that the traditional system is looking for alternatives, and XRP is part of that conversation. So the real takeaway here is not excitement, it is awareness. Awareness that global finance is evolving, awareness that liquidity is becoming digital, and awareness that early positioning in transformational systems has historically been one of the most powerful financial opportunities available. And as we move deeper into this series, the focus will become even clearer. What happens when demand meets utility at a global scale, and why even a seemingly small holding like 1,000 XRP could one day represent something far beyond what most people expect today. The more deeply you look into XRP's long-term positioning, the more you start to realize that this is not just a story about price speculation, it is a story about financial infrastructure quietly being rebuilt in real time. And when people hear statements like 1,000 XRP will change your life, the natural reaction is often skepticism. But that skepticism usually comes from viewing XRP through the lens of today's market, not tomorrow's system. Right now, the financial world is still heavily dependent on legacy infrastructure. SWIFT, correspondent banking networks, and pre-funded liquidity accounts still dominate how money moves across borders. These systems were built decades ago, long before digital assets were even a concept. concept, and while they have served their purpose, they are increasingly under pressure in a world that demands faster, cheaper, and more transparent settlement. That pressure is exactly what opens the door for new technologies like XRP to be evaluated at an institutional level. What makes XRP unique in this discussion is its focus on settlement efficiency. It is not trying to replace entire banking systems overnight. Instead, it is positioned as a bridge, a layer that connects different currencies and financial systems without requiring massive capital to be locked up in advance. This idea alone has massive implications for global liquidity, because liquidity is the lifeblood of finance. Without it, money becomes stagnant. With it, money becomes fluid, efficient, and scalable. Now imagine a scenario where even a fraction of global cross-border payments begins to route through XRP-based liquidity solutions. We are talking about institutions testing corridors, payment providers integrating new rails, and financial networks exploring digital settlement optimization. Even small percentages of adoption in a system that moves trillions daily can create enormous downstream effects. And this is where the conversation about scarcity and value starts to become more serious. Because XRP is not just a concept, it is a finite digital asset with defined supply mechanics. If demand increases due to real-world usage and supply remains relatively fixed in liquid circulation, then the natural economic response is upward pressure on value. But unlike speculative assets that rise purely on hype, XRP's potential value narrative is tied to utility. That distinction is critical. Utility-driven demand behaves differently. It is more persistent, more structural, and less emotionally driven. This is also why long-term holders often focus less on short-term volatility and more on positioning. They are not reacting to every market cycle. Instead, they are watching the gradual integration of blockchain-based settlement technologies into real financial systems. And while progress may appear slow from the outside, in institutional terms, it is actually quite significant. Regulatory discussions, pilot programs, and infrastructure testing are all part of a larger shift that does not happen overnight. When you combine all of this with the psychology of early adoption, the idea of holding even 1,000 XRP begins to take on a different meaning. It stops being about how much is it worth today and starts becoming about what could it represent if adoption scales globally. And this is where most people struggle, because human psychology is naturally short-term oriented. People want immediate validation. They want instant results, but transformative financial systems rarely reward impatience. Instead, they reward conviction during uncertainty. Every major technological shift in financial history followed the same pattern: early disbelief, gradual awareness, institutional testing, and then sudden acceleration once the system reaches critical mass. We are still somewhere between the awareness and testing phase when it comes to digital liquidity solutions like XRP. That means the biggest part of the move, if it happens, is still ahead of the curve rather than behind it. At the same time, it is important to stay grounded. No asset is guaranteed to succeed at scale. Adoption depends on regulation, integration, and real-world utility proving itself consistently over time. But what cannot be ignored is the direction of travel. The financial system is clearly exploring faster settlement mechanisms, tokenized liquidity, and blockchain-based interoperability. And XRP remains one of the few assets consistently mentioned in that context. So when the statement 1,000 XRP will change your life is made, it should not be interpreted as a promise. It should be understood as a perspective that small positions in transformative systems can become significant if the system itself becomes widely adopted. That is the core idea being explored here. It becomes increasingly clear that XRP's long-term story is not being shaped in public excitement, but in quiet institutional testing, regulatory alignment, and gradual financial integration. And this is exactly where the idea of 1,000 XRP will change your life begins to either make sense to someone or get completely dismissed depending on how they interpret the evolution of global liquidity systems. To understand the potential impact, you need to focus on one core concept: money movement efficiency. The global financial system is not just about storing value, it is about moving value. Every second of every day, massive volumes of money travel across borders for trade, remittances, banking settlements, and corporate transactions. Yet the underlying systems that handle this movement are still slow, fragmented, and heavily dependent on intermediaries. Each step in that chain adds cost, delay, and friction. Now imagine a financial layer that removes some of that friction, not by replacing banks, but by enhancing the way liquidity flows between them. That is where XRP's positioning becomes relevant again. In theory, it can act as a neutral bridge asset that allows value to transfer between different fiat currencies almost instantly. This is not about speculation. It is about settlement efficiency at scale. And efficiency at scale is one of the most powerful forces in global economics. When institutions test systems like this, they are not thinking about short-term price charts. They are thinking about corridor optimization, liquidity cost reduction, and settlement finality. If a bank can reduce the cost of moving money from one region to another, even by a small percentage, that translates into enormous savings when multiplied across trillions in transaction volume. That is why even pilot programs and limited integrations matter. They represent proof that the system is being evaluated in real financial environments. This gradual testing phase is often misunderstood by retail participants. They expect immediate visible impact on price, but institutional adoption does not work like that. It starts quietly, with small corridors, limited liquidity pools, and controlled environments. Over time, if the system proves reliable, it expands. More corridors are added, more institutions participate, more liquidity flows through the network, and only then does the broader market begin to notice the effects. This is where the idea of liquidity expansion becomes critical. If XRP begins to be used as a bridge in even a small percentage of global settlements, the demand profile changes fundamentally. It is no longer driven by speculation alone. It is driven by operational necessity. That is a completely different category of demand. Speculative demand is emotional and cyclical. Utility demand is structural and persistent. Now, when you connect this with the fixed nature of XRP's supply model and circulating liquidity dynamics, the conversation naturally shifts toward valuation possibilities, not predictions, not guarantees, but scenarios based on how financial systems scale. If demand increases due to real usage while available liquidity remains relatively constrained, then value adjusts to reflect that imbalance. That is basic economic principle, but applied at a global financial scale. This is also where most people misjudge assets like XRP. They try to evaluate them using the same mindset as traditional stocks or short-term crypto trades. But infrastructure assets behave differently. You do not evaluate the internet based on early website traffic. You do not evaluate mobile networks based on early SMS usage. You evaluate them based on what they enable once fully integrated. XRP sits in a similar category, an infrastructure component rather than a consumer-facing product. So when someone says 1,000 XRP could change your life, the real underlying assumption is not about magic price appreciation. It is about asymmetry. It is about the possibility that a relatively small position today could represent significant value in a future where the asset is actively used in global financial settlement flows. That asymmetry is what attracts long-term believers, even during periods of uncertainty or slow market movement. At the same time, it is essential to remain realistic. Adoption is not guaranteed. Financial systems are complex, heavily regulated, and resistant to rapid change. Many technologies are tested and never fully implemented at scale. XRP's role, while promising in theory, still depends on execution, regulation, and sustained institutional interest. Nothing in financial markets is certain until it is fully realized. But what is certain is the direction of innovation. The global financial system is actively searching for faster, cheaper, and more efficient ways to move liquidity. Blockchain-based settlement models are part of that exploration, and XRP continues to exist within that conversation as one of the assets designed specifically for that use case. So the takeaway from this stage of the discussion is not hype. It is perspective. Understanding that value in financial systems is not always immediate. Sometimes it builds quietly in the background, tied to infrastructure adoption rather than public attention. And those who position themselves early in those transitions often find themselves in very different outcomes compared to those who wait for confirmation. Everything comes down to one central idea. Transformation does not happen loudly at first. It builds silently, layer by layer, until the system itself begins to shift. And that is exactly why the statement 1,000 XRP will change your life should not be read as a promise, but as a reflection of how asymmetric opportunities form when financial infrastructure is evolving. If you look at every major shift in financial history, the pattern is always the same. Early skepticism, limited understanding, slow institutional testing, and then sudden acceleration once adoption reaches a tipping point. The internet followed this path. Mobile banking followed this path. Even Bitcoin followed this path, moving from an ignored concept to a globally recognized asset over time. XRP in this context is part of a broader conversation about how value is transferred in a digital-first financial world. The key difference with XRP is its intended role in liquidity movement. It is not positioned as a store of value in the traditional sense, nor purely as a speculative instrument. Instead, it sits in the middle of settlement infrastructure, where value is actually transferred between systems. If that role expands, even partially, into real-world financial corridors, then the implications are not just technical, they are economic at a global scale. Think about what happens when financial institutions prioritize speed and efficiency in cross-border settlement. Every improvement reduces friction, every reduction in friction increases volume, and every increase in volume requires deeper liquidity integration. In that kind of environment, assets that support settlement efficiency can move from being optional tools to essential components. That transition is what changes everything. Now, when people hear 1000 XRP, they often compare it to today's value and dismiss it as insignificant or overly optimistic. But that comparison ignores the core principle of infrastructure evolution. The value of a network asset is not only defined by its current usage, it is defined by its future role in systems that may not yet be fully realized. If XRP's utility expands across global payment corridors, then demand dynamics shift from speculative interest to operational necessity. This is where market psychology becomes extremely important. Early stages of adoption always feel underwhelming to most participants. Price action may not reflect long-term potential. Sentiment may fluctuate. Narratives may compete. But underneath all of that noise, infrastructure continues to build. And once enough integration exists, the market often revalues the asset very quickly because expectations suddenly catch up to reality. That moment of revaluation is what creates asymmetry. Not guaranteed outcomes, but disproportionate potential relative to early positioning. And that is the foundation of why some investors focus on accumulation rather than short-term trading. They are not reacting to today's chart. They are positioning for a scenario where global liquidity flows through a more efficient system. At the same time, it is important to stay grounded in reality. No financial asset moves in a straight line. XRP's journey, like any other digital asset connected to global finance, depends on regulation, adoption speed, institutional confidence, and macroeconomic conditions. There will be periods of uncertainty, volatility, and even doubt. That is normal in any emerging financial technology. However, what remains consistent is the direction of innovation. The global financial system is actively exploring faster settlement rails, tokenized liquidity, and blockchain-based interoperability. Whether XRP becomes a dominant player in that system or simply part of the broader ecosystem, it remains aligned with a clear trend, the modernization of how money moves globally. So when you bring everything together, the infrastructure narrative, the liquidity mechanics, the institutional testing phase, and the psychological nature of early adoption, the idea behind holding 1000 XRP becomes less about fantasy and more about positioning. Positioning in a system that is still evolving, still being tested, and still finding its final structure. And this is where the real message of this entire series becomes clear. Life-changing outcomes in financial markets are rarely about large capital at the start. They are often about early understanding, patient conviction, and the ability to hold through uncertainty while systems mature in the background. Whether XRP reaches the scale some believe it can or not, the principle remains the same. Asymmetry exists where adoption is still developing. It is important to make this clear. This content is not financial advice. It is an exploration of ideas, market structure, and potential scenarios based on current technological and financial developments. Cryptocurrency markets are highly volatile and unpredictable. Anyone participating in them should conduct their own research, understand the risks involved, and make decisions based on their personal financial situation. And with that, the core question remains open, not answered with certainty, but left for reflection. If global liquidity continues shifting toward digital settlement systems, what could 1000 XRP represent in a future where efficiency defines value more than anything else?